just the image of a certain localization of conscious contents.
Two wonderful ways of looking at things. Take your pick. Before I go on to solipsism and perhaps how it's actually closer to physicalism and materialism, can you just define in the simplest terms you can what consciousness is, Rupert?
Consciousness is that with which our experience is known. It is that within which everything appears, and it is that out of which everything is made, or of which everything is the activity.
That was nice and concise. Bernardo?
Well, nice and concise. Fair enough. It's difficult to you're just on the fly, but it should be something that at least these guys have settled on a very, very strict definition before they are heading into creating this foundation and so on, right? They should be completely aligned with this and have something that is that which this, that, and the other. How do I go from that definition back to the reduction base? What is that which in this definition that refers to reduction base? The only thing I can deduce from this definition is that it is some kind of awareness of that experience. So if I'm maybe a little premature here, but it's like these are so incredibly important definitions and steps taking now when you are taking your first steps ahead from your reduction base, right? At this point, definition must be very clearly related to reduction base. As soon as they start to wander into cloud castles of weird abstractions and so on, be very careful that you can follow this kind of reasoning, right? Or whether or not they're based on axioms or definitions and so on. What I tend to hear from these guys, at least, or particular Bernardo Kastrup, is just coming up with something that fits the bill, right? Just coming up with something that is sort of sounds like it could be a valid definition, but the checkpoint is, does it follow from the reduction base? Otherwise, if it doesn't necessarily follow from the reduction base, I think you should reject it. Or at least go back to the reduction base, maybe check whether, maybe I should check whether or not this is actually a good reduction base, is a reasonable reduction base, right? Because you could say, if mind is not something that experiential, then you can't experience mind. And if you can't experience mind, you cannot be aware of it, right? So how does this work? I can't experience mind anywhere, right? I have qualia, but I don't have mind, right? Just labeling everything as mind doesn't help me one goddamn freaking millimeter, right? That's just a term that is slapped on everything and say, it's mind. Okay, so what? I don't care if that elephant is mind. What the hell do I do with it, right? That's what I want to get to ultimately. If I didn't want to do something or relate to it or base my decisions upon the experience, why does all this matter then? All this philosophy, if it's not going anywhere, right? So, just my comment, right? So I'm mixing this deconstruction to a very large extent with my own, I'm reflecting from my own philosophy, right? Both for my own sake, sort of a ping pong back and forth, right? But also to illuminate to you that I have actually done some thinking around these things. So I'm not just deconstructing from some kind of empty idea of my own significance, right? And I will be willing to, as soon as I bump into something which I haven't sufficiently, which I am aware of, not maybe not something that I have done sufficiently, I will point it out and say, well, that's not something I have done too much of. Maybe I should do more of that, right? I will be willing to do that. So when that happens, I will say so. But until then, I'm reflecting from my own standpoint, but I think that's the only way I could do it, right? And also because these are so foundational, it's like if you want to go to the moon, right? There is a certain trajectory and speed you have to go with, and if you don't do that, you will not end up on the moon, right? Presumably, right? So the same kind of thing. If you don't start off your philosophy from a sound foundation, it's never going to be a good philosophy, right? You're going to drag along all sorts of problems that will accumulate into some Frankenstein idea of knowledge and even more Frankenstein idea of ethics and so on, right? That is based on a faulty ground floor, right? So these, I appreciate that these guys are taking a stab at it, right? From a simple some virtuous attitude that I appreciate that. That I will be the first to state that, right? But that doesn't mean I'm going to lick their ass, right?
Yeah, it's
Sometimes I hear when I listen back to I listened back to the one I recorded yesterday. There's a part before this one, and I sometimes I'm very much this kind of the elephant in the toy store or the kid in the Emperor's New Clothes who say, hey, the Emperor doesn't have any clothes on, right? While all the grown-ups say, oh, Spira and Kastrup, they're so great philosophers. Why, they don't know shit about fuck, right? And also, I sometimes feel like, if you know the old movie called Amadeus, which is one of my personal favorites, he's like this this genius kid, right? Not, I feel like I'm a genius, but that's not the part I'm reflecting on, right? But that he's sort of this obscene kid, right? Who has this incredible ability to create new music, right? That will always be evergreens, right? Sometimes I feel a bit like, Mozart or Amadeus there with all these fancy, court people and the emperors and so on, right? Who basically in the movie don't know shit. All they have is, the emperor, and they have to lick his ass in order to get somewhere, right? Where Mozart comes in and just being himself, right? Which is not allowed. You cannot be allowed to be yourself. You cannot say shit and fuck and asshole, right? If you've seen, there's also Eddie Murphy's, he has a stand-up show which was recorded back in the 80s called Eddie Murphy Raw, which I can, recommend to you, where he also is like that guy was the Bill Cosby calling him and saying, "You cannot say these words on your show. My son is not allowed to hear it." And what words? But then these words you say. What do you mean? Shit, fuck, asshole. Okay, that was a little sidetracking, right? But so it's like I feel like I'm this guy will say, "Hey, that guy doesn't have any clothes on," and they're all, "No, you can't say that. You're not allowed. The masters has told us you should be nice, right?" I'm the little kid saying the emperor's not even. He's wearing his baggy pants at the gala show, right?
good to add something to that. Maybe another formulation. Consciousness is that whose excitations are experiences.
What's an excitation, right? Now, this trick is very important, right? This is very important. This is fucking very important. Okay, let me clarify. When people define, right, they are using terms to define, right? When you're defining something, you're defining a term, right? Otherwise, what the hell are you doing? Now, in order to define a term, you have to use some other terms, right? Obviously. So, you're just moving around the definition onto a new word, right? It's an excitation. Okay, what's an excitation, right? Well, it's something that I came up with. Well, that doesn't work. I have to be able to experience it, right? That's why the reduction base is important, because when you start to define things, you need to be able to connect these terms back to that reduction base, right? He basically says here he doesn't know what he's doing, right? He's just moving a definition from one term to another term, making you think that he has defined something he hasn't. Not philosophically rigidly, as I would expect it to be, right? Because what is the ground floor of this series of definitions, right? Okay, what's an excitation? Then he'll use another word. That is some kind of ripple. Okay, what's a ripple? And then you'll possibly get angry at you. But I just said there were ripples. Oh, so your definitions is based on something that you came up with, right? And I don't think they used the term excitations before, right? So what is an excitation then? That just came out of the blue, right? So these guys don't know what they're doing. It's very clear. It's so basic, man, right? That's why you need to work from the reduction base that everybody can relate to, in the sense that if I say my reduction base is elephant, then people should be able to go and experience elephant without me telling them what it is. That's more correct than saying it's an excitation. An excitation is a sort of a third derivative of an experience. And that is what he's claiming is at the basis of my awareness of my experience. I don't buy it, right? It already now, you see, it's so convoluted and so pointing in all sorts of directions where you might fall in the trap of saying, okay, I guess I'm just too stupid, like this interviewer says, right? It's because I'm too stupid. No, you're not stupid. If you're saying this sounds weird, right? Stay with that. Stay with that weirdness and say, I'm not buying this until it falls into a place where I say, of course it follows, right? If you take some term that you don't understand and need a definition, and then they use another term that you don't understand in order to define the first term, you haven't gone anywhere, right? So,
if you mean by define consciousness, if you mean by it how I use the word, then I use the word in the sense of phenomenal consciousness, without entailing or requiring any higher level mental functions, such as self-awareness, metacognition, and so forth. So if you have experience, then you're conscious. Even the simplest experiences already imply consciousness. Technically, this is called.
So when you have an experience, he says he's always conscious of it. So, but whenever there is an experience, you are conscious of it. Isn't that sort of, this is kind of difficult also, in my opinion, right? But you don't need to explain too much in order to get somewhere, I believe, right? You don't, I don't think you need to explain, go crazy in explanations. You need to settle certain aspects in order to get to the next point. But you don't need to dive into some kind of encyclopedic definitions of everything. You might. I might be wrong on this, right? But if an experience if an experience is experienced, then you're aware of that experience, meaning that which you can experience must be aware of, otherwise you do not have access to the experience. That's what I'm hearing. Now, I might be misunderstanding his definition there, right? So, whenever you have an experience, it must be because you're aware of it. So all experiences come with awareness. Or are there kinds of experiences you are not aware of, and therefore you don't think that you have the experience, though you might have, but because you're not aware of them, you're not conscious of those experiences. So is awareness a subset of experiences? Those experiences you can be meta-conscious about, right? You can be aware of or have reflect about and so on, right? There might be a huge, larger set of experiences, but those which you're not aware of. And I might be able to go there, right? Because in a way that you can move, I believe that vision and colors, qualia and vision is the essential sense, right? That is what creates that makes you able to cognize, it makes you able to have a sense of space and so on, right? It's very important. Of the five senses, this is by far the most important one, I think, right? You're not using sounds all the time, you're not using smells all the time, and so on, right? But you're using as soon as you wake up, ding, there it is, and it stays there until you close your eyes at night, so to say, right? So it's on all the time. That's possibly why, when you measure on the brain and so on, it's sort of like 40% of the brain is used for vision or something like that, right? That's just a representation, I know that. That's not an explanation of metaphysics. Please bear that in mind, right? But when I move my eyes around, it's like there's a periphery of my visual field that is not that important, because it's more like the closer it is to the center of the experience, the more focused the mind is on that, right? And if I hear something out that is in another direction than my focus, I might turn my head and turn my eyes in that direction so I can focus on that, right? So I think it's sort of a gradual thing that you are most aware of that which is directly in your focus of your vision, and then the awareness diminishes, or what's the term? Yes, fades into something that is sort of unaware of, right? Or unconscious of, right? But you can't be conscious of something with, in his terms used here, without being meta-conscious. You can experience something in the corner of your eye, so to say, without actually being directly aware of having that consciousness, right? Now we might start to mix the terms here, because you tend to use some other terms. I like that meta-awareness, or that consciousness, to be what he calls meta-consciousness, right? And the awareness is that experience. The awareness is the degree to which I am focused on the experience. Okay, this might be a little hairy, right? So I think I'm on board with this. This is good enough to go, right?
Phenomenal consciousness, and that's what I mean when I use the word consciousness. Now, if you mean by it, give me a way to explain consciousness in terms of something else, then I draw a blank, because I think consciousness is primary. I can explain everything else in terms of consciousness, but not.
You can explain in terms of consciousness. What is in terms, not in term, but in terms. So there's more than one term of consciousness. I'm just, it's not, but these terms, if there's only one thing, and that is consciousness, they said that, Spira said that before. In terms of consciousness, there must be more than one term then. So what are these different terms? Is he alluding to some kind of sophistry now? Or, it's like, I don't express anything in terms of consciousness. All I'm hearing they're doing is, whenever you start to say, what is it all made of? Then they will say consciousness or mind or something like that, right? But when they're doing the actual philosophy, it's disconnected from this reduction base. It's just sort of an ever omnipresent kind of thing. They can always claim that, yeah, of course, what I'm talking about is all mind. But let me go down here and screw around with my concepts, right?
Consciousness in terms of something else, because you cannot reduce one thing to another forever. At some point, you hit rock bottom in reality. And I think...
Yeah, that would be the reduction base, right? Wouldn't it? I would think so. Otherwise, you would have two rock bottoms, right? You might not hit rock bottom. It depends on how you approach it, because I think the problem of science is that they are working with models and concepts, right? They are not working with something that experiential. Although that when they go and do the scientific experiment, of course they're using their empirical approach, using the senses and looking at the meters and looking at the flowers and whatever they do, right? But the model they are working on behind in order to establish something they use to describe what is going on are all concepts. Like an atom is a concept. It's not an experience, right? And superstrings and quarks, and these are all models. They're all conceptual stuff, right? Geometric spheres or whatever ideas they are, fields of, whatever, right? These are concepts. They are not experiential. And because this idea, okay, if I go down in reduction, if I'm reducing the atom to smaller bits, at some point I might hit some kind of rock bottom. Well, that's the problem. They can't do it because it's not based on experiences. It's based on abstractions. And they're trying to take those abstractions because they're easy to work with mathematically and try to predict what they're going to see using their experiences, ignoring the hard problem, right? That's why the way they're doing science is potentially doomed, you could say, right? It works so far as you can say when you have, 1 molar of this and 2 molar of that. When we are used to seeing that it comes out and looks like this, there will be 1.5 molar, whatever, right? 2 molars of X, right? Of a new stuff that is combination of those two. That works. It gives us the necessary insight in order to do some chemistry or whatever, right? But it doesn't explain anything. It doesn't explain anything. It's just, this is what usually happens. So when you have one of these and 2 of these, it combines into one of these, and then you have, stoichiometry, right? What I'm trying to get at is what is problematic in science is that they are ignoring the sense ground floor of the reduction base. That has to be the ground floor, not the abstractions or the concepts like little balls or little fields or something like that, right? Because then they're staying in their conceptual understanding. At some point, they need to convert that into some kind of experience, right? That doesn't work, and that's why there's a hard problem, right? But these guys are actually doing the same thing. They're trying to extract themselves away from experiences. Those are just some funny stuff going on your living room walls, right? There's a big mind out there, much more important, right? And it's an excitation. So now we're staying in abstractions, right? I can't experience an excitation. That's some word and a concept or a model or abstraction that somebody came up with, right? So
consciousness is that rock bottom. So there is nothing I can explain consciousness in terms of. So that's why I prefer to say consciousness is simply that whose excitations are experiences.
So it's experiencing.
Our language and our way of thinking sort of tries to say what consciousness is as if it were a thing that you could point to and say, there is consciousness. Here it is. It's a thing of some sort. And of course, that's contradictory with consciousness. Consciousness is that within which things appear.
Now, I would agree that all these terms, mind, and they're also making this faulty way of describing it. They have equated all sorts of terms like consciousness and mind and ripples and also basically equating various, or at least creating some confusion about what do these terms actually mean. Are you using different terms for the same description, and so on. And in general, when people talk about all this mind and consciousness and awareness and subconscious, it's these terms are just thrown around in one big pile. There is no heads or tails in how they're used, right? It doesn't sound like that. And they are also sort of suffering from this mix of the use of the words, right? Now that might be sort of, when you're discussing this on the fly, you might, in the vocabulary, just pick the words that come to mind when you discuss this and forgot that you used a different term, 10 minutes ago. So I'm fair enough, right? But we have to be strict about it, right?
It's not itself a thing. It's not itself a substance in the literal sense. Consciousness is pure subjectivity. If you need to think in terms of
consciousness is pure subjectivity. So now we are going into more abstractions, right? Consciousness is pure. That was not what he said before. And now I forget what he actually said. But it was not that it was pure subjectivity. Now he's still using a different term, right? I mean, to the best of my, condensation of what we have been talking about these last 37 minutes, it has only become convoluted and cumbersome and confusing, these explanations, in my opinion, right? It might make sense in their head how this hangs together, right? But the way they're presenting it is kind of not exactly all over the place, but confusing because they're not sticking to the terms used, right? He just made a definition of consciousness, and now he's using another definition of consciousness. What the hell is he doing, man, right? I'm not buying it, right? I mean, if you don't get your shit together, you get your fucking philosophical shit together, right?
Things. Whatever you do there, it will be wrong. But what is the least wrong way to think of consciousness in terms of a thing?
No, it's a definition. Consciousness, what are you referring to when you say consciousness? Stay with that definition that you had. And the problem is possibly that definition you made is not functional. So you have to come up with something else to describe it now. Pure subjectivity, right? Which is not dysfunctional also because it doesn't help me relate to the reduction base, right? And because the reduction base is everything, but I can't experience it, you can basically come up with any kind of definition you want and me not being able to connect it to the reduction base because it's always there. It's omnipresent reduction base. So I'm rejecting it, right? I mean, I might be inspired here and there with a little thing. Oh, yeah, I might agree, but in the overall picture, I'm not buying this, right? I'm not buying it because it doesn't hang together. It's not rigid, right?
Think of it as empty space. It's still completely...
No. I don't want to think of it as... I don't want any analogy, right? I don't want analogies. Describe the actual thing you're referring to. My definition of an orange is it's like a ball. Okay, I know what a ball is, but I still don't know what an orange is, right? So don't describe it as is something else. It just points to the fact or to the aspect that you haven't created rigid definitions. And maybe it's because you don't really understand what you're talking about, right? Because you so badly want to go in and say, oh, there's ripples out there, right? I have control over the big mind. I'm like coming back to you and preaching what the big mind has told me, right? That's what I'm hearing.
Wrong. But it's less wrong than to think of it in terms of an object or a substance. Think of consciousness as empty space and experiences.
Why would I think of it as empty space? What is space and what is space? Space is something that is experience or created from experience, at least, right? It's not experienced, I would say, but the mind has created space. So in order for me to have experiences, these experiences is sort of placed on this spatial scaffold, which is, I would think that he would agree with, right? That kind of description. So that can't be if it's a part of the placement of the experience, it can't be a part of my consciousness, which is some kind of awareness of the experience. So you can't think of it as space or empty space, right? You're mixing the ideas here. It's not clear enough. Your foundations are not solid enough in order for me to get on board with this philosophy here, right?
As excitations of that empty space, which
Excitation, I don't know what an excitation is, right? And don't force me to, just because you're making a statement and sort of, it's like when you're saying, don't think of a polar bear, then you're thinking of a polar bear because the concept polar bear was mentioned, right? So when he say an excitation, immediately my mind tried to imagine some kind of excitation. And then he will say, aha, see, that's what it is. But he's just tricking your mind into creating something. And then he's saying, that's what it is. That's a sophist trick, right? Like the guy who says, don't imagine a polar bear. And then you can't help imagining a polar bear because you're imagining that which you're not supposed to imagine, right? So he's tricking you into creating a mental picture that is that will satisfy you enough to go along with it, right? But what the hell is an excitation? It's just a sound he makes with his mouth, right? It's basically a qualia, an experience. So now you are listening to your experiences in order to understand the experiences, how to go about it, right? You can't let your experiences direct your philosophy, right? Your philosophy should be disconnected from the experiences and what the experiences might, the selfish experiences, the selfish gene might be there to manipulate you, so to say, right?
creates the world.
You mentioned things, which brings us neatly to physicalism/materialism. And so, as I said, I came across a few comments on various forums that dismissed sort of the non-dual idealism understanding in terms of this solipsistic outlook. But actually, and I didn't even realize this until very recently, thanks to you, Bernardo, materialism, so the current model of reality that has more in common with solipsism than idealism, than non-duality, because the implication is it's actually everything we experience is taking place in our brain, in our mind. So can you just explain that in the simplest terms possible?
Under materialism, the qualities of your perceptual experiences, all the colors you see, the sounds you hear, the smells you taste, the textures you touch and feel, all these qualities are generated by your brain inside your skull. If you look up to the sky at night and you see a bright star, say Sirius, that quality, that star you see, that thing you perceive, all those qualities, all of that perception is happening inside your skull. So your real skull under materialism is above the stars as you see them. Now, materialism would say there are real stars out there, but they're not what you see. They have no qualities. They are pure abstraction. You cannot visualize them because if you visualize it, you're already bringing qualities into.
Really? Is that what materialism says? I'm not quite on board with that. I think I know where he's going, right? Now I'm sort of premature jumping in the middle of his speech here, right? But just, so this is a deconstruction, right? Isn't it? It's not a commentary. I think that when I try to dig deep into how I was doing materialism before I realized the problem, right? That it was like I had both of them at the same time. I had the outside world, and then I had some conceptual thing going on in my mind that sort of was, it's like the, what's it called? Epistemology, is the description of true, I think. That, or knowledge, it's I forget what it's called. Something like the comparison version of truth, right? That it's true if you have a concept in your mind that is identical to the concept you're experiencing outside, right? Not realizing that you do not have these two versions that you're comparing all the time. You only have one version that you compare to maybe what was going on a split second ago, or a memory, or the cognition, the cognitive apparatus, and your concepts residing there, right? So it's like working from the idea that you're having both. You have an outside kind of experience, and at the same time an inside version that you're comparing to that outside, and saying, yes, because I am experiencing elephant inside, I must have had that concept elephant inside, because there's an elephant out here, right? But that's the freaky misunderstanding of the experience. None of your experience is any kind of outside directly, but it's merely potentially a representation that you have settled on axiomatically, right? And that axiom sort of built in from the childhood, and has forgotten, sort of, you could say, to use that terms, that you're actually working from that axiom that is an outside directly, right? And it has become the actual outside. That's the problem. There's a tendency that people who are philosophical but also very scientifically approach, they have a tendency to diminish the importance of qualia and experiences, just like, illusionists and Keith Frankis and these types, right? Daniel Dennett. It's almost like it's not really interesting because it's not scientific. It's just your weird little colors and so on, right? That's the drawback from this kind of paradox that they're working from. I'm maybe cycling a bit here. Let us go further into what he's saying.
The picture, and under materialism, qualities are created by your brain inside your head. So under materialism, the world of your experiences is entirely within your real head.
Bernardo, can I just ask, just quickly, when could you just elaborate a tiny bit on qualities, what you mean by that?
Qualities is colors are qualities, melodies are qualities, flavors are
melody is not a quality. That's an interpretation. A sound is a quality, right? A melody is a particular set of sounds you have interpreted as a melody, right? I mean, you have to be careful with this, right? It's colors, it's sounds, it's tastes, it's feels, and it smells, right? I don't know if the term is feels, but you know what I mean, right? And smells, right? It's not melody. Melody is an interpretation, right? A melody is described using, what's it called? Notation, what's it called? Scores, right? Because there is some kind of interpretation and systematic approach to it that is conceptual, right? But there's no notes for a sound, right? It's a sound. The quality of the sound and the particular type of sound compared to some other sound can't be quantized and be, interpreted, right? So just be careful about these terms, because if he's fading the lines between when something is an abstraction or an interpretation and when it's the actual raw experience, there's a problem.
Qualities. The world as it is in itself under materialism has no qualities. It has no colors, has no tastes, has no.
He can't say that. I would say that I would go with that possibly that conclusion, right? Because it's so different from your experience that you can't even say what the hell it is. So therefore I will also be careful to say that it's not this. But I would say I wouldn't say there isn't sounds and colors and so on. I would say it's not sounds and colors, right? I don't know if maybe I'm fly fucking this too much, right? Maybe. But it's like when if you're saying, I am experiencing bicycle, so therefore there is no bicycles out there, right? I could say that that because I'm experiencing bicycle, it cannot be a bicycle out there. But still, I can't say there isn't. I don't know what I'm actually not trying to say here, but I'm just very, very, very careful about making square judgments about what is there and what isn't there, right? Because if I have to stay behind the wall, the only thing I can say, I can't go there. So to the best of my understanding, I cannot say anything about what it is or what it isn't. So I can't say there isn't colors and there aren't colors, right? But I would say that it's the same thing he's possibly trying to say. I'm just being very, very, very strict with this about any claims, any potential attempt at claiming what is there and what isn't there. Be fucking careful, right? Because it's this constantly pounding on this wall and until see, I got my hand through the wall there, right? By just using lingo and words and, and at some point people are going to say, I guess he's penetrated the impenetrable wall, right?
Smells. It has matter. And what is matter? It's something entirely defined in terms of quantities, of numbers. It's an abstraction. You cannot visualize it.
Good. It's an abstraction. Thank you. It's an abstraction, right? So, it's not something you experience, right? I mean, because abstractions is something that is based on experience. It's something that you do inside your mind somewhere, on the other side of experiences, compared to that outside you do not have access to. So, when you experience, your mind abstracts something. You could say there's a difference between an abstraction and a cognition. That might be a good idea. I'm still working on it, right? But when you are cognizing elephant, you're not abstracting elephant. But I could be abstracting the idea of a circle or an oval or something like that from elephant. The shapes and geometry or something like that, that could be an abstraction. When you're talking about abstract art, right? If you made a circle and two squares and long stick, they could say that looks like an elephant. But it's an abstract form of an elephant, right? But the abstraction is something that you could actually abstract from elephant. These general shapes that we then can go and mathematize into oblivion, right? And create all sorts of fancy mathematics from these abstractions. We can't do it directly on the elephant, right? So abstractions are sort of third level derivative from that which you do not have access to, right?
But theoretically, if you provide a long enough list with the relevant numbers, you will have said everything there is to be said about matter as defined under materialism. It has no qualities. Under materialism, all qualities are somehow, nobody has any clue how, not even in principle, somehow generated by your brain inside your head.
Can I ask you a question, Bernardo?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I'm asking you a question. I know it's not what you believe. If I were asking a materialist, someone that has this view that you've just given, that all of them, that the world really exists inside our head. So what about the head itself? Surely if the world exists inside the brain, inside the head, then the brain and the head must exist in... the argument falls apart there.
A materialist would say...
Yes, the materialist argument falls apart there, because they're basically saying there are two places at once, you could say, right? And that doesn't make any sense philosophically. That doesn't sound rigid philosophy. I mean, maybe you can balance it and get away with it, right? I mean, apparently, science does that to some extent, right? But there is a sense that science is sort of has abstracted itself into a corner now, where it's sort of the explanations is there an infinite number of universes with infinite number of this, and you know, the conceptualization and abstractions are so convoluted now, or superstrings are 11 different dimensions, and so it's screwed into oblivion that nobody can handle this, and nobody in their right mind would go and use this for anything that is important in their everyday, right? I don't give a crap how many dimensions there is between atoms and so on, right? It doesn't help me get to a summer holiday in Greece with my children, right? So I would like philosophy to be more grounded in reality, so that I can use some foundations, a reduction base that is simple and approachable for me and potentially for everybody, right? So that I ultimately can get to a point later where I can have a clear idea of knowledge and ethics and so on, a moral principle that is based on this grounding. Because if you cut the wire and let your philosophical balloon go into abstractions, you are leaving behind the grounding, and you are ending up floating around in these abstractions and these platonic forms and whatever, and you're staying there. You're not coming back to Earth, right? So that's what I see as a problem with people who are very they're probably indoctrinated with some kind of religion, usually, no, possibly, that they have been struggling with all their life, this sort of sky ghost that is everywhere, right? And then this idealism comes along, and they say, that fits the bill. I can connect the dots from science to woo-woo shit, and you know, so they have been looking for this all their life to explain why, so that they won't have to say that mommy and daddy are crazy, right? So when you're coming from, as I do, from the scientific point of view, right, and realizing there is this paradox in this kind of metaphysics, right, then you come from with a sort of a scientific mindset, you can say, which is very grounded in reality. Whatever you say about science, it's very grounded in empirical understandings, right? You have to be empirical about it. You have to observe it and so on. Yeah. People go directly into abstractions also when you're doing science, but they do it from an empirical point of view where they are there at the situation where they experience this and reach these abstractions, right? Idealists, they sit at home and think that they are talking to the big mind. They're not going out and being empirical, right? Because they don't need to. They have these abstractions. They are wandering around in their platonic forms and so on, right? That's what I find dangerous about idealism, is that they're living in their cloud castles, while the naturalists and the physicalists and the materialists, they're going out into nature and observing. I would rather have that than some weirdo idealist, right?
The head you see in the mirror is not your head. It's an internal representation of your real head created by your brain.
Yeah, the real head. But I understand what he's saying, and I agree. But the real head is sort of implying that there is a head, something that is like a head, but just different. No, he should say, head is a representation of potentially something going on outside my mind that I have no clue what is, right? Head is just the mind's way of representing it. And how I get to say that it's a representation, I only do that by stating the axiom that I'm working from the idea that these are representations.
What about the brain then?
The brain, you see, if you crack...
I mean, it's the same thing. It's exactly the same. It's just something that is inside your head, right? It's the mind representing that which it doesn't have access to.
My skull open is not my real brain. It's an internal representation of my real brain created by your brain inside your real skull. The real brain, the real skull under materialism have no qualities. They have no color, no qualities whatsoever. They are pure abstract.
No, I'm warming up to this. he might actually be onto something, right? Because when you're talking about the standard model, it's not about colors, it's not about texts, right? It's about numbers and abstractions and so on. Just like I said, so he is actually pointing to the problem, which is alluding to the hard problem, I would say. And I get it now. I get it. I am on board with this. I agree with this, I think.
Action. They are defined in terms of a list of numbers and mathematical relationships between these
Exactly.
numbers, like spatial temporal position, mass, charge, spin, momentum, frequency, amplitude, and all that. So now, most casual materialists don't know this. Because if they knew, they would say, this is absolute nonsense. I mean, I'm replacing reality with an abstraction, which happens to also not work, because there is no coherent and explicit way to tell how quantities can generate qualities. It's an absurd.
Now, but then the interesting point is, so then science shouldn't work, should it? It shouldn't work. If we can't explain, if the way they're doing science is contradictory or incorrect or something like that, then science, you shouldn't be able to build bridges and so on, right? But there's something to these concepts, the cognitions, that works. Otherwise, we wouldn't have bridges and cars and so on, right? Because it wouldn't function. So there's something to it, right? It does work to some extent. It's this thing that because we are working from the cognitions, we are sort of diminishing the importance of the experience, the direct qualia. I'm not interested in whether or not the saber-toothed tiger is light brown or dark brown, right? I'm interested in whether or not it's a saber-toothed tiger or it's a female I want to copulate with, right? I'm hoping not to, confuse them, right? So the qualia is not really important, but the cognition is very important, right? In this kind of thinking. So it's very quickly that the mind, because of the awareness and consciousness, we are juggling around these cognitions in order to get around in the world. We don't care too much about the qualia. As soon as they have condensed into a cognition, then we are dealing with the cognition, and the cognition is then the second derivative of that which we do not have access to, right? But that's what we are dealing with, the cognitions, and we sort of put the colors aside and sounds aside, because now we're dealing with whether or not it's a saber-toothed tiger or a lovely female, right? So, and that is kind of the abstraction. So we are more interested in the cognitions and abstractions and so on than the base raw qualia. And because we are so quick to jump into to cognitions and abstractions, that's what we think we have to deal with in science. And therefore we have, no, I'm saying we, I don't like, therefore it has become the way to go in science, juggling around concepts and abstractions and so on, and coming up with all sorts of formulas and so on, right? It works to get, because when we create something, we do it from a cognitive, abstract point of view, and when we check whether or not it works, we quickly jump into those cognitive and abstractions again, and then see that it works. It may be a different cognition than the ones we use to create that kind of cognition, but we are sort of constantly jumping ahead of the qualia. Sort of qualia is just the instrument we use to get there. So that's why it works. But making the potential problem that we are actually just completely setting the qualia aside and saying we don't need them because we have our concepts and cognitions, right? Now, you can't do that. You can't set the qualia aside because that's what was there in order to get to the cognitions, right? So that's why I'm saying we move that qualia, the qualia, into the center of the philosophy, because it's so foundational. Without them, you have nothing, right? Okay, I hope it makes sense to you.
It's an inversion of reasoning, so to say.
Rupert, can you just then, I've heard you dismantle it in very simple terms, the material model. So I'm going to challenge you to do that again. And I know that, you're not going to be pulling something from memory, but I've seen you do it in a couple of sentences before and really starkly paint how absurd it can be. So I'm going to challenge you to try and do that again if you could.
Not sure I'll manage 2 sentences, Simon, but I'll do my best. The only thing we can be certain of is...
What is this? He has to close his eyes. It's like I have to meditate for 10 seconds. And I'm being very, I'm meditating. Oh, please be silent while I'm concentrating.
the knowing of experience. And in fact, not even the knowing of experience, as if the knowing of it were one thing and experience itself was...
Knowing? Now we're talking epistemology, or, result of epistemology even, right? They haven't defined what it means to know. That's a whole set of philosophy that is beyond metaphysics, right? In the sense that you have to settle your metaphysics before you even attempt at doing epistemology. And you have to do epistemology before you can make any claim of knowledge. So using the term know in I'm always looking for this, right? Now, it may be sort of a figure of speech and so on. Okay, I'm willing to be a little flexible here, right? But there are these cornerstones of philosophy, like knowledge, right? Using the term know is not very beneficial for you to do good metaphysics, my opinion, right? It might illuminate that you're not really understanding what the hell you're doing, right? You don't have the full picture of what it means to do this.
Something other than knowing. All we can be certain of is knowing.
Certain. All that we get. But what do you mean by certainty? Certainty is a special kind of knowledge, right? In fact, I hesitate to use the term in fact, but facts is also a kind of knowledge, right? A certain aspect of knowledge. Certainty is knowledge that is unchangeable. What else could it be, right? If I say that's an elephant, am I certain about it? No, I'm just claiming knowledge. There's nothing about that knowledge of elephant that makes me able to qualify it to be certain knowledge. What would I add in order for it to be certain? I'm just experiencing an elephant. So I know elephant, right? I'm jumping into a bit of epistemology here, just to clarify, right? But what makes it certain? I can't tell you if I should experience that elephant, right? And I can't tell you if I shouldn't experience it. I can only clarify to myself I'm experiencing elephant, right? So it makes sense for me to say I know elephant in that case. What would be certain? I don't know what the certainty would be, right? If I say it's a certain elephant, I'm just upgrading my knowledge to another level without actually adding anything to it, other than I'm affixing a new word to it that sounds more, cut in stone, right? When you think about it, what could possibly be certain, right? Are we going into some Cartesian doubt here, where I say I'm certain I am because I think, and that's sort of okay. Fair enough. You think, therefore you are, and that you're certain about that. Okay, good enough for me. I mean, I don't need the certainty. That's just another way of saying I think, therefore I am, right? So the term certainty doesn't add anything. And even if he could elaborate on something or philosophize his way to some kind of certainty, for him, that wouldn't make it certain for me, right? That's an authoritarian approach, where I am certain about this, and therefore you should accept that, right? And if you say, I'm certain of it, but I have to let you decide for yourself whether or not, then it's not certainty, is it, right? So be careful when people talk about certainty, right? So now there's two problems here. He talk about knowledge and he talk about certainty, as if it's just arriving to me. Yes, I don't have to explain anything. I'm bringing in epistemology into metaphysics. I can do that because I'm Mr. Philosophy.
That's the only absolute certainty I'm using. Knowing.
Now it's absolute certainty, right? You know. Oh man, it's a cumbersome deconstruction, this, right? I mean, they can't even get off the ground here, right? It doesn't work, this shit, man, right? The thinking they have been doing and trying to align here in some aspect, in some way or another, right? Between them in this essential foundation. There might be some good thinking there, but the way they present it, it is... what word should I use, man, right? Maybe just refer to the last, 4 hours of because now I went over the 1 hour mark, so fuck it, right? It's I need some strict definitions, and I need a good reduction base. And you can't just keep adding new words to describe it, but you define this, and then you define it, and the next moment you use a different definition of the same thing, which is a cornerstone, which is consciousness, and so on, right? It's simply not serious enough, this, right? It's not serious enough. Okay. I think we'll have to let him end his talk here, and then I think I'll stop.
Synonymous with consciousness, but I use the word knowing to try and bring it close to our experience. There is the knowing of the sound of my voice, the knowing of the sight of your screen, the knowing...
Can you know that? Why is it knowledge? It was qualia. Isn't that good enough? Why do you need to upgrade it to knowledge? What is it about it that makes you upgrade it to knowledge, right? You're just saying it as if it follows. That doesn't, knowing is what is that? You can't experience knowledge, right? You can't say, hey, that's knowledge. It's a definition of some aspect of your experiences or your cognitions or your consciousnesses or whatever, right? It's some kind of classification of it. When this is the case, then I will call it knowledge. You should approach it that way, so we are strict of what we're doing here. You can't just start to say, well, knowledge and the colors, and it's too far fluffy. It's simply too fluffy. If this is all you need to do in order to do epistemology, I would say, okay, this is not good enough, right? Because there are people spending, I mean, that might be a little, over the top, but spending all their life doing epistemology, trying to come up with a definition of knowledge. And he's just doing it here like, hey, colors is knowledge, right? Right?
Of the temperature of the air on your face, the knowing of whatever emotion you may be experiencing. There's just the knowing of experience. Knowing is the only substance that is ever known or experienced.
Substance? It's the same problem all the time with this, right? There are never any really clear definitions. It seems like people are coming up with this on the fly, right? And it's basically just throwing around words, hoping that you accept this as a kind of philosophy, right? It seems to me it's just throwing around words. That sound like, I could also find a dictionary of biochemistry and find a lot of fancy words there and then throw them around and convince you that I'm doing biochemistry. But that doesn't make it biochemistry, does it, right?
So anything that we posit outside of knowing is an abstraction, a mental abstraction that can never be verified. Because if we were to come in contact with it, all that we would know of it is the knowing of it.
No. Yeah. Okay, but you said it's an abstraction, and you said you can't know what it is. But then you can't call it an abstraction, right? I mean, it's this. No. If they haven't at this point said, okay, I have established an external realm, something beyond my experiences, which the experiences is based on. Fine. So far, so good. If they're not saying, in my opinion, okay, now it's shut off what it really is, the real head, the real brain, right? I can't get to whatever it is. And actually, I can't call it brain or head because I have no clue what the fuck it is. I only have the mental representation of something that I am axiomizing to be a representation of something else, right? That I do not have access to. If they're not clearly stating, I have no access to that. If they're saying something like, there are abstractions out there, but I can't get to it, something like that, then they're violating the whole idea of something that is inaccessible. It can't both be inaccessible and then they start to talk about what it is. In some kind of abstract form, in like abstractions or excitations or ripples or something like that, because it sort of fits with the Maxwell's equations or fields or whatever, right? So they're staying in these abstract castles and trying to convince you that they can actually say something about what it is. I'm staying away from that, right? So this is all the trying to get out of the start blocks, diffusing that border so much that you are accepting that they can go and tell you something about what it is, right? Be fucking careful with that, right?
So knowing is the only certainty. It's the only thing, which is of course not a thing, that has ever been experienced or could ever be experienced by anybody. I'm implying that knowing is known by a person. I don't mean that. Knowing is that which knows. So this knowing is known by itself. That's all we can be.
Okay, you lost me now. Knowing is known by itself. No. He may have an idea in his head what he's trying to convey, but I can't put the pieces together now, right? This doesn't work for me. It is too woo-woo shit for me, right? The knowing is knowing itself. No, I can't go there, right? It has to be grounded in your reduction base. And that's why you're screwed, right? Because your reduction base is a singularity that is everywhere, right? That's why you at some point will start to call it God, right? And that fits the bill so perfectly because that's basically the dots you want to connect, I presume, right? But you have no relation from your statements and your definition to that reduction base. It's just this omnipresent thing that you can just always say, yeah, but it's all mind. So let me get back to my abstractions, right? Please. No.
Sure of. So if we want to build a model of reality that is anything other than, or could ever be anything other than a mental abstraction, unrelated to our experience, why don't we start with what we know, with what we have in our hands, knowing, consciousness, and only resort to something outside of that if our current experience cannot be satisfactorily explained.
What? Satisfactorily explained? What is the... Now, I'm very careful here, right? This is potentially where the rocket into the unknown is, kicked off, right? When we can't sufficiently explain it, let's say that it's all mind. Something like that, right? That's apparently the trick here, I suppose.
Using only consciousness, which it can.
Mind, not consciousness, right? Consciousness was something that was aware of the experiences, right? Or a double whammy of experience and awareness together into something called consciousness that you're not meta-conscious of, right? And I mean, but just be strict with these terms, man, right?
And not only can our current experience be explained very satisfactorily, referring only to knowing or
But I would like to know what they mean by explain. What do you need to explain? If I'm having a set of colors, sounds, taste, and so on, do I need to explain them? Right? Why do I need to explain them? It's almost like evolution has explained it for me. They are there. This is what we have come up with, and deal with it, right? This is what evolution has come up with. This seems to work. Try and use it, right? You can't explain it because it's just there. With this fetish with I need to explain, right? Bernardo Kastrup himself says that the rock bottom is what you can't explain, and that is also the starting point of philosophy. The rock bottom reduction base, right? You can't explain it any further. That means the rock bottom is inexplicable, right? So the foundations of your philosophy is inexplicable. So why are you talking about explanations? Are you trying to say, yes, you have to explain it until you reach that rock bottom? But then what are you doing? What do you do when you reach that rock bottom? You don't stay at rock bottom and say it's inexplicable, because then you're basically a solipsist, right? You have to go back into philosophizing your way back into normal everyday reality, you could say. How do you do that? Just by saying, I'm starting to explain things, basing my explanation of my rock bottom inexplicable reduction base. How the hell does this fit together, man? Man.
consciousness. There are so many aspects of our current experience that cannot be satisfactorily explained under the prevailing materialist paradigm.
No, but maybe it's because it can't be explained. It's not necessarily. Yeah. It's like the one of the wheels on this bicycle doesn't function, so therefore bicycles are wrong. No. Maybe it's just you need a better wheel, right? That materialism has a problem with this paradox doesn't mean that everything that science does is just weird, shitty stuff that is, get away with it, right? So he is using a huge flaw, of course, in the metaphysics. It's basically not metaphysics. It's a kind of physics that ignores metaphysics, maybe you could say, right? But that there's a problem there doesn't mean that everything that science is doing is incorrect. Science is particularly not explaining anything. Even if scientists believe they're explaining something, they're not explaining anything. They're basically saying how these things that are inexplicable is going to unfold in the future. We have a pretty good idea using our scientific, crystal ball, right? But we are not explaining elephant. We are not explaining apples. When I get hit by the apple and it falls on my head, I can tell you a bit about why that occurs using all the other stuff that is there to explain that thing, right? Or explain the behavior of these things, right? But I can't explain to you what the things are. And my contention would be neither can philosophy. Okay, we will stop here at, we are 46 minutes, as far as I can see, into their video, and 1 hour, 1.25 into mine here, right? So please share, like, and subscribe, and all the good stuff. Consider the board, link below. Otherwise, see you next time. Have a nice day.